I've made plenty of planes, cars, and even boats in Besiege, but somehow I've never made a train. And in order to give myself a little extra challenge, I wanted to set 2 rules. Now firstly, I wanted to make a working steam engine to power my train, so I couldn't just use any powered wheels or gears to help myself along. And second, I wanted to make the train able to drive itself in at least one complete loop. Now Besiege can have some interesting physics at times, so I wanted to do my best to keep things as stable as possible. So for my first idea here, you can see me putting down a long wood beam, and off of that, I'm starting to put down some wheels. Now my plan was to make a monorail type device here, and the advantage of this is that by having a lot of wheels in contact with the center beam, it should improve my stability. So you can see me getting in some wheels now, and you can see I'm also extending them to further improve my stability. But once I had 3 of these in place, I wanted to try it out, and you can see at first it isn't terrible. Now it is still moving back and forth more than I'd like, and in order to fix that, you can see me putting down some pistons, and by doing this, I should be able to extend them and force the wheels into that center beam. Trying this out though, I noticed it wasn't really working, and I thought the problem was that I was gonna need a set of wheels on the top and the bottom to pinch against there as well. Now I started to build this over on the side, but I noticed pretty quickly that there wasn't gonna be enough space, so you'll notice that that rail in the middle is now composed of 4 logs instead of just 1. Now by doing this, I had just enough room to fit in all of the pistons, and once I got all the pistons put back in place here, you can see me bracing them all together once again, and I wanted to give it a shot. Now at first, it seemed to be sticking to that center beam more than I'd like, but in order to fix that here, you can see me replacing those unpowered wheels with powered wheels, and just for now, I wanted to see how it would move. And giving it a shot now, it seemed to be pretty good. Now I didn't have the pistons extended yet though, and once I did that, you could see that it was dramatically better. So I wanted to give myself a little more space to mess with next, and for a little bit more stability, you can see that I added on a second copy of this behind the first one. This should prevent it from tipping back and forth, and by doing that, it seemed to be a lot more stable. There was a lot of smoke coming off of this though, and that's what happens when you have parts rub against each other in Besiege. Now it wasn't necessarily a problem, but it's the sort of thing that does indicate there's friction, so I wanted to look out for that. Now my bigger issue though was that this was still powered with powered wheels, and I was gonna need to change this over to some sort of steam power source. So the next thing I needed to do was build a version of this that used gears instead of those powered wheels. Now my first few attempts here weren't great, and I didn't really have a clear idea of how I wanted to link these all together. Now eventually I realized I could slip some gears in the corners here, and they just barely end up meshing with each other. By doing this, I had 2 sets of these wheels connected together, and ideally, I wanted to make all of those corners align in the same way. Now, this was definitely a lot harder than it looked, because things tended to want to just fall apart on me, and I had to use really small components to fit in all of the gaps that I had left. But you could see here, eventually I got 3 of the sides connected, and getting the last side on wasn't too much more difficult. I did notice, though, it didn't want to spin very freely, and all of these gears together did have a lot of slop that I thought was going to create a lot of extra friction. But the next thing I wanted to do here was add on some pistons to force those wheels against that center bar again, and it did seem alright here. As I was moving it around, it didn't seem too much different than the other design, but in order to power it, I just put on a powered gear for now, and I noticed that there was just a lot of extra friction. It seems like the tension the pistons are putting on all of these wheels are making it a lot harder for them to spin, and while the powered wheels are happy enough to move around, any sort of unpowered design was just gonna have a lot of trouble, and I was worried that an engine wasn't gonna be able to supply enough power to even get it to start moving. So with the monorail design looking like it was gonna have a lot of problems, I wanted to try switching over to a more normal train design, and see, to get started on that here, I started building up a rail, and on that, I wanted to put down a car. Now there's nothing too special about this car, and you can see it pretty easily fell off the tracks. And just by rotating the rails out a little bit, you can see that I actually did quite a bit better. Now the problem is though, it was still trying to come off the rails pretty easily, and to make it stay on permanently, I was gonna need a different wheel design. Now to start building that up here, you can see me stacking on a bunch of wheels and building up what's sort of like a cone, and while this kind of worked, it was a little hard to keep together, and I tried switching over to gears here, which were behaving a little bit nicer. Now, the reason that I wanted to use cone-like wheels, I'll explain it a little bit, but you can see that for now, it was mostly holding itself together, and just by deleting off a few of the gears here, it actually was working pretty well. Now, it was moving slightly side to side, but overall, it was staying on the rails for a lot longer than before, although there was going to be a very important aspect to these rails that was going to cause some problems. You can see I'm rotating them up here, and because eventually I would like the train to take a turn, this was going to be pretty important, and as it stands, this car wasn't able to really take that turn well. Now, I figured at least part of the problem was that my rails were really large, and by making them a lot thinner, it's a lot easier for the car to grip onto them. Now, you can see already that this did improve things, and I'm starting to be able to take this turn. Now, by taking it faster, you'll notice something really interesting about the wheels here, and I wanted to talk about this. Right now, as the car is coming through that corner, you'll notice it's at a very slight angle. Now, this is actually intentional, and if you look at the way the wheels are positioned right now, the two outermost wheels are riding on these innermost large gears, while these two wheels on the inside of the turn are going to be on the smaller gears. Now, this is really important because since that outside edge of the track is going to be longer than the inside edge of the track, as those outside wheels rotate around a larger circle, they're going to be moving a little bit faster, and that's going to allow them to compensate for the larger distance they need to travel. If I just use straight wheels, this would end up being a problem, and the car would end up getting ejected off of the turn, kind of like we saw before. Now, that specific implementation of wheel, though, still had some problems with jumping on the track, and I wanted to try to smoothen it up a little bit more. Now, in order to do that, a pretty easy way to go seemed to just be using a surface piece, and you can see with this, I can get a much smoother transition. Now, once I got everything put in place here, I decided to paint it up, and you can see me copying that over to all of the other wheels. And it was working, but it wasn't working exactly the way that I was expecting. Sometimes it would go around a turn and tilt in the direction that I wanted, but sometimes it wouldn't, but either way, it seemed to do the job, so I decided that maybe I made the angle of the wheels a little too sharp, and I wanted to try to make them a lot less steep. Now, another important aspect to this is that each wheel needs to be going the same speed as its opposing wheel, so I linked them together here, and giving this a shot, it didn't seem to be working as well. So I switched back over to the small wheels here, and once again, it seemed to actually be working. So even though it wasn't exactly working the way that I wanted, I still wanted to try hooking up another car and seeing if the two of these could work well together. Now, at first, I just used a hinge to link these together, and trying this out, it was alright enough on the straightaways, but as soon as it tried to take a turn, it bound up too easily, and that pretty much made it impossible to keep on the track. Now, at first here, I was just using a hinge to link these together, but while I was at it, I also wanted to try getting rid of the powered wheels and replacing them with unpowered wheels. I was gonna have to do this eventually anyway to get the steam engine working, so once I got that copied over to all the wheels, I also decided I wanted to try moving these two wheel sections further apart. This should make it turn a lot easier, and you can see me linking them together with a couple of swivel joints and a brace. Now, because this is unpowered, I need a way to move it around, so I decided to use a couple of long ropes to pull this along here, and at first, it didn't seem too bad. I was still staying on the track, and while it was a little hard to get these ropes to pull this in exactly the way that I wanted, it did seem like it was staying on decently well here, and by expanding some of these unpowered wheels to keep the car from jumping off the track, it did manage to get all the way to the end of the rail. But of course, it's kind of annoying to pull this around with ropes, so I decided that now would probably be a good time to start working on the steam engine. Now, to start on this, I put down 4 large wheels, and you can see that the inside wheels are a little bit bigger than the outside wheels. This will keep them on the track a little bit better, and with that in place, now I wanted to try to copy a couple of these back, and you can see here it does seem to be moving on the rails pretty well. So next, I used a few swivel joints to link these all together with braces, and after that, I wanted to try to add on some steam cannons. So I braced to a ballast pretty high up in the air, and on that, I put down a swivel joint, and that'll allow it to always point straight down. And to complete the design here, I put down some sliders, and finally put down that cannon along with a torch. And after cranking the cannon strength up a lot, I wanted to give it a shot shot, and it had a few problems. Now first, it kinda seemed to pull the entire train off of the rails, but it was starting to move it back and forth. Now I was happy to see that much, but instead of having this point straight into the ground, I wanted to try rotating everything 90 degrees down, and this also should make it a little more compact. So after getting that all rotated, I also doubled up the sliders, and this should make it a little bit stronger. Now finally here, I'm putting down a couple of cannons, and you can see me giving it a shot. Now I may have made it a little too strong at first, but it was starting to move at least, which I was pretty happy about. But to balance it out a little bit more, I wanted to add a couple of cannons to the other side, and for some extra testing, I extended out the rails even further. Now trying again here with a little bit more restrained cannon strength, it did seem to be working pretty well. Now one of the big things I was happy about was that the little wheels were staying on the track. I hadn't tested them at a fast speed yet, so this was pretty good news. And once I saw that, I did want to try redesigning some things just a little bit to improve my overall efficiency. Now part of that was just reducing the number of parts on this overall, and you can see now I have a much more simple design. The idea here is I could get rid of most of those sliders because they have a lot of slop in them, and it's a little hard to get them to behave well. Now my first test here was once again a little chaotic, but it did seem to mostly be working. And as another quick improvement here, I offset each of the cannons by 180 degrees so that there's one always pushing my train forward. Now also, to start to automate this thing, I added on a couple of angle sensors, and these will detect where in the rotation those wheels are and automatically turn on the cannons to start pushing forward. Now with this, I was starting to move forward pretty well here, although I noticed there is a little bit of side to side movement as one cannon or the other kicks on. Now I also wasn't in love with the angle of the cannons in the front here, and as they swung back and forth, they seemed to either be shooting into the air or directly into the ground. Now I tried correcting for this by flipping around the cannons 180 degrees and then angling them slightly up so that they'll be flat when they're firing. The problem is though, now they were shooting into the wheels and that was creating a lot of drag. So next I was thinking about using some 4-bar linkages to smoothen up the motion a little bit, but this was a lot more complicated than I really wanted, and ultimately I did decide to use sliders, although I had a much better way of using them now, and it seemed like the engine was working a lot better than before. But with that looking pretty good, now I wanted to slide over the set of wheels that I conveniently left over on the side and see if I couldn't get them attached onto the train. Now at first, I tried using a couple of hinges here, and it wasn't bad, but I could tell there was a lot more load on the engine, and I was having a bit of trouble moving it around. Just by adding on some power to those cannons though, I was doing a little bit better here, and I was pretty happy with how smooth it was. With that looking good though, now I wanted to add on the real challenge, and this was going to be a lot of large wood panels. These tend to be very heavy, and it was also going to be very top heavy, so I was worried that there was going to be a lot more derailments once these were in place. Now trying this out here, it did seem to be working pretty well, although the train once again was going slower than before. So to fix that, I decided to paint the train red here, which everyone knows is a faster color, and this did seem to solve that problem. But seriously, the next thing I wanted to do was try to add in a turn to this track and see if it could still make it around corners. I had realized at this point, I never actually tested if the engine could get around any turns at all, so that was going to be a huge issue if it couldn't. And trying it out here, you can see I have a very shallow turn, and unfortunately, it did end up binding up on this. Now I was trying to look for the main problem, and it seemed like there were two big issues. Now the first was that the front wheels wanted to slip off really easily, and it's because these wheels don't really perform that well when you're pushing against them. They perform a lot better when you're pulling them. Now overall, just by using some larger wheels, I was mostly able to solve it, although they still would pop off the track a lot. So I tried using a few springs here to guide them more to go straight, but even this still wouldn't work and they'd pop off pretty quickly. So I tried using some larger springs next, and surprisingly, this also didn't really seem to work. But next, what I wanted to do was try adding some extra wheels beneath the ones I already have, and by doing this, they'll ride on the rails and guide the car in the right direction. This did seem to work pretty well here, and you can see now the car car really isn't jumping on the track at all. Once I did this, it actually seemed to be working pretty well here, and the next thing that I wanted to do was copy over that extra wheel design to all of my other cars, just to make sure they stay on the track as well. And of course, while I was at it, I also wanted to add on some extra cars, which did create a lot of extra load for the engine to pull. It seemed to mostly be working though, so now I wanted to try expanding out the track and see how far I could get this. Now, one big thing I also wanted to add was a bit of a ramp here and see if I'd be able to pull myself up it. Now, I was worried that I was gonna stall, but surprisingly, the steam engine seems to go around the same speed regardless of what slope you put it on. I think part of the reason is that as the steam engine moves, if the wheel ends up having a bit of trouble moving on the track, it kind of just slips against the track, and it kind of works like a clutch so that it can never quite stall the engine. Now, some might call that inefficiency. I'm gonna call that a feature though, and I'm gonna move out here to design the cow catcher. I don't really have any cows to catch, but I think it looks cool, so you can see me putting that in now. And once I got that all in place, I also wanted to design the rest of the engine. And with that built up and also painted up, I tried pulling it along here, and it was working pretty well, although there is still one thing I really wanted to do. Right now, my track kinda goes nowhere, and I wanted to see if I could make an entire loop around the map and still have the train be working. So I went ahead here and copied over a few sections, and you can see that I wanted to have this big winding turn that goes beneath this bridge. And with that in place, I wanted to give this section of the track a test. Now, once again, I was coming up this ramp section pretty well, although it seemed like those panels I added on to the engine didn't really want to stay on. It didn't really seem to affect performance though, so I decided to just continue with this, although there was an issue. Eventually, I reached a section of track that kind of got destroyed, and I was wondering what happened here. Now, I looked in the editor and saw that my track was going straight through some tents, and originally I figured they just explode as soon as the track loaded in. It seems like when they do that though, it also blows up the track as well, so I had to patch this up a little bit and raise the track slightly above those tents. Now, with that in place though, I also wanted to finish up my rail, and you can see me copying over another curve section behind my train and connecting up to that back half that went underneath that bridge. Now, trying this out, I had a lot of wood pieces loaded in, and the game was clearly very unhappy about it. At 50% simulation speed, there is still a lot of lag, although it also did still seem to be working. And this time I was even able to get over that ramp section without the train's engine exploding. Now, I kept continuing on here, and eventually I started to climb this big slope into that turn. I eventually noticed that I forgot to brace a single piece of wood, and it kinda seemed to fall off. Now, ultimately, this did cause me to have a bit of damage, and you can see that one of my cars lost a bunch of its panels. Now, because the lag was getting really bad, I wanted to make sure I at least got one good run before everything exploded, so I helped it along a little bit here, and I wanted to see if I could get back to my starting position. Now, after I got through the tunnel here, it was quite literally all downhill from here, and with not too much difficulty, I made it to the last turn. I was a little concerned because I was approaching this turn with more speed than I had ever approached a turn before with, but it seemed to slow down pretty quickly and manage itself well. After just a little bit more distance, I got back to where I started, and overall, besides the last passenger car, this actually did seem to work. Overall, I was pretty surprised that the normal train design actually ended up being the best one. I really thought I was gonna have to do something weird like that monorail in order to get this to be stable enough, but once I figured out how to get those wheels to stay on the track, there was pretty limited problems. But if you guys have any other ideas for what I should build in Besiege, make sure to leave them down below. And make sure to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And otherwise, till next time.